There are moments in history when everything we thought we knew about trust, power, and justice is called into question. When the lines between right and wrong become so blurred that we no longer know where one ends and the other begins. This is one of those moments. The FBI. The very name conjures images of justice, authority, and the relentless pursuit of truth. For years, the agency has been hailed as a symbol of national security, a guardian in the shadows, keeping watch over threats both foreign and domestic. But what if, in their pursuit of justice, they themselves became a threat? Imagine a time when the world was on the brink of change, the 1960s, a decade defined by civil unrest, political upheaval, and the fight for equality. The FBI, charged with defending the country, found itself not just protecting the nation, but targeting its own citizens. They watched, listened, and in some cases manipulated. Behind closed doors, far from the public eye, secret operations were unfolding. Operations so controversial that when they were finally exposed, the consequences would be felt for decades. This isn't the story of a rogue agent or a minor scandal. This is the story of an agency that, for all its power, may have gone too far. An agency whose actions raise the most unsettling question of all. Who watches the watchmen? What happens when the very people entrusted with keeping us safe are the ones we need to fear? This is the story of the most controversial cases in the history of the FBI. The cases that not only shook the agency to its core, but also left a nation questioning its trust in the very institution meant to protect it. Founded in 1908, the FBI was established with one simple mission: to protect and defend the United States against criminal threats, to uphold and enforce the nation's laws, and to safeguard the principles of justice. Over the years, it has become the nation's most powerful law enforcement agency, investigating everything from organized crime to domestic terrorism, and tackling threats both foreign and homegrown. From the early days of tracking down notorious criminals like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde, to its role in cracking down on organized crime families, the FBI has often been at the forefront of America's battles with crime. But it wasn't just criminals the Bureau set its sights on. As the nation faced political and social upheaval in the 1960s and beyond, the FBI also turned its focus on civil rights leaders, activists, and political dissidents. The Bureau's power, while crucial in many areas, has often been used in ways that sparked public outrage, from covert surveillance on individuals fighting for racial equality to secret operations aimed at undermining social movements. The FBI's methods have at times seemed less about upholding justice and more about controlling those who dared to challenge the status quo. These actions, sometimes questionable, often controversial, and occasionally downright shocking, have led to legal battles, public outcry, and a growing sense of unease about the very institution meant to protect us. This is the FBI's paradox, a force for law and order whose methods often defy the very laws they were sworn to uphold. The year is 1969. Across America, the country is teetering on the edge of change. The civil rights movement, which has already rewritten the rules of the nation, is now gaining momentum, pushing for equality, justice, and an end to racial oppression. But with that progress comes a backlash. And behind the scenes, in the shadows of Washington, D.C., an uneasy question starts to rise. What happens when the system feels threatened? At the heart of this unease was the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, an enigmatic figure whose influence shaped the Bureau for decades. Hoover saw himself as a protector of the American way of life, but he was also deeply suspicious of the changes sweeping across the nation. For Hoover, those changes, specifically the rise of civil rights movements, represented a direct challenge to the established order. And no group, in his eyes, posed a greater threat than the Black Panther Party. The Panthers, founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in 1966, had gone from local activists in Oakland, California, to a national force, pushing a radical message of Black empowerment, self-defense, and resistance to police brutality. To Hoover and the FBI, they were more than just a political group. They were a dangerous one, capable of inciting violence and undermining national security. So, the Bureau began its most ambitious covert operation to date. It started slowly. A tip here, an informant there. The FBI began surveilling the Black Panther Party, tracking their movements, listening to their meetings, shadowing their leaders. But surveillance wasn't enough. As the Panthers expanded their reach, so too did the FBI's tactics. Undercover agents infiltrated their ranks. These agents became trusted allies, gathering intelligence from the inside, feeding it back to Hoover's office. Their orders were clear: find anything that could be used to dismantle the Panthers. Soon, the operations expanded beyond the Black Panther Party. The FBI targeted activists, civil rights leaders, and even prominent public figures like Martin Luther King Jr., who Hoover believed was a threat to national security due to his ties with certain anti-government organizations. Wiretapping became routine. Phones of suspected radicals bugged, conversations intercepted, personal lives were scrutinized, families torn apart by the relentless tide of covert surveillance. The government, under Hoover's leadership, was watching them all. Every move, every word. The FBI didn't just want to monitor. They wanted to disrupt. They wanted to sow distrust, fear, and confusion within these movements. They wanted to tear apart the foundations of the organizations they deemed dangerous. They sent anonymous letters, sometimes forged, attempting to turn activists against each other, to create division, to incite paranoia. They planted false rumors, offered bribes, and employed every psychological trick they could think of to destabilize their targets. But the real horror wasn't just in the surveillance. It was in the overreach. In some cases, the FBI would stage elaborate schemes, like sending out death threats to key figures, or even attempting to set up leaders within the civil rights movement for criminal charges. The line between law enforcement and political sabotage had blurred so completely that what they were doing was no longer recognizable as protecting the public. It was protecting a narrative. As the program escalated, the FBI believed it was justified. After all, they were doing what was necessary to maintain order, but the lines between what was lawful and what was morally acceptable had already begun to fade. They didn't see the people they were targeting as citizens, they saw them as enemies, and in their minds, the ends justified the means. But then, in 1971, something unexpected happened. A group of ordinary citizens, activists, suspicious of the FBI's growing reach, decided they had seen enough. They broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. It was a simple burglary, the kind that goes unnoticed every day. But the people who committed this crime didn't steal money or jewels. They took something far more valuable. Thousands of documents detailing the FBI's covert operations, including COINTELPRO. These documents revealed the Bureau's decades-long campaign to sabotage and undermine the civil rights movement. And they were about to be made public. The scandal erupted like wildfire. The truth was out, and it would not be easy to bury. The nation was stunned. How could the very agency charged with protecting the public had gone to such extremes? How many people had been hurt, manipulated, or even destroyed by the FBI's actions? And more importantly, what would happen now that the world knew the full extent of what had been done? The COINTELPRO operation, once a well-kept secret, was now in the spotlight. The Bureau's credibility, already strained, was on the brink of collapse. This was not just a few overzealous agents going rogue. This was a systematic campaign spanning years, sanctioned at the highest levels of government. The public's trust, already fragile in the wake of the Vietnam War in the turbulent 60s, was now shattered beyond repair. But what would happen next? What would the consequences be for those who had run COINTELPRO, and how would the country respond? Would this revelation tear apart the trust between citizens and the very agency meant to protect them? And could the FBI ever regain its credibility, or was the damage too great to repair? The year was 1971. The storm had broken. The documents from the break-in in Media, Pennsylvania, had unleashed an unstoppable wave of outrage. Within weeks, the public learned the extent of the FBI's covert operations against not just the Black Panther Party, but also against civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political dissidents. The magnitude of COINTELPRO's reach and the scandal surrounding it sent shockwaves through the nation. For the first time, the FBI, an agency that had long been a symbol of justice and order, was facing a public reckoning, and the fallout was swift. The American public, already distrustful in the wake of the Vietnam War and the social upheaval of the 1960s, now found themselves questioning the very institution they had long relied upon to uphold law and order. The revelation that the FBI had been surveilling and manipulating civil rights leaders, political movements, and even ordinary citizens shocked the nation. And as the details unfolded, it became clear that the Bureau's actions had gone far beyond the bounds of legality and morality. The response from the FBI was at first to deny, minimize, and attempt to shift blame. Hoover, in particular, was steadfast in his defense of the agency's actions. He justified the Bureau's operations, claiming they were essential to national security, that the FBI was simply protecting the country from radical, violent elements that sought to destroy American society. The idea that the FBI had targeted groups based on their political beliefs was dismissed as paranoid and dangerous rhetoric. However, as the public pressure mounted, the FBI could no longer ignore the growing storm. A Senate investigation was launched, led by the Church Committee, a special investigative panel named after Senator Frank Church. The committee's goal was simple: to investigate abuses of power by the intelligence community, including the FBI, CIA, and other agencies. What the Church Committee uncovered was a series of shocking violations of constitutional rights, revealing the full scale of COINTELPRO's reach. The committee's findings were damning. The FBI, under Hoover's leadership, had not only surveilled and sabotaged political organizations, but had also orchestrated a covert war against the very foundations of American democracy. They had used false information, forged documents, and dirty tricks to destabilize political movements, disrupt campaigns for social justice, and undermined public trust in the system. And it wasn't just limited to the Black Panther Party. COINTELPRO had targeted everyone, from Martin Luther King Jr. to anti-Vietnam War activists, from Native American groups to Puerto Rican independence movements. The public response to the revelations was nothing short of explosive. Protesters gathered in cities across the nation, demanding accountability from the FBI and the government. The betrayal was felt deeply, especially among those who had been targeted by the FBI's surveillance program. The civil rights community, already fighting for justice in a deeply segregated society, now had to contend with the harsh reality that the very agency meant to protect the public had instead worked tirelessly to undermine their cause. For African Americans, particularly those in groups like the Black Panther Party, the revelation of COINTELPRO was nothing new. Many had long suspected that the FBI was conducting covert operations against them. What shocked them, however, was the scale and the audacity of the Bureau's actions. The FBI wasn't just monitoring them, it was actively trying to destroy them. Families were torn apart by lies and false accusations, and the effects of the FBI's interference were felt for generations. But it wasn't just the civil rights movement that was impacted. The fallout from COINTELPRO shattered the trust of the broader American public in the government and its institutions. If the FBI had lied, spied, and interfered with American citizens' lives, what else had it done without the public's knowledge? The revelation planted a seed of doubt that would linger for years, one that would grow into a full-blown crisis of confidence in government agencies. As the public outrage reached its peak, the question became, who would be held accountable for these abuses of power? But the answer was unsatisfying. While the Church Committee's investigation was thorough and laid bare the extent of COINTELPRO, no FBI officials were ever criminally charged for their actions. The political ramifications were severe, but the personal consequences were much less so. Hoover, who had overseen the operation, was never brought to trial. He remained in power until his death in 1972. The political leaders who had been complicit or had turned a blind eye largely escaped punishment. And although the FBI was forced to curtail its surveillance programs, many of the tactics used in COINTELPRO would continue under different names and guises, often justified in the name of national security. Yet, despite the lack of criminal consequences, the exposure of COINTELPRO had a profound effect on the FBI's reputation. The Bureau, once a symbol of justice, now stood at the center of a national crisis in trust. For many, the very idea of federal agencies having untrust power became a dangerous and untrustworthy concept. COINTELPRO proved that the systems meant to protect citizens could easily be turned against them. The long-term consequences of COINTELPRO were profound and far-reaching. The scandal left a permanent scar on the FBI's relationship with the American people. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, and for many, the idea that the government could be using its vast power to manipulate and control its citizens became a real fear. In the decades that followed, the FBI would continue to be scrutinized, not just for COINTELPRO, but for its broader role in surveillance and intelligence gathering. As new technologies emerged, new concerns arose about the agency's potential overreach. And while reforms were implemented, the damage done to the Bureau's image was irreversible. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the deepened skepticism towards federal agencies, particularly among marginalized communities who had been the targets of COINTELPRO. The lessons of the scandal didn't just affect how the FBI was perceived. They shaped how generations of Americans would view government overreach and the dangers of unchecked surveillance. But in the wake of COINTELPRO, another question remained. What happens when the government's desire to control and monitor its citizens becomes a permanent fixture? What happens when the lines between security and civil liberties are drawn so fine that they begin to vanish entirely? And as new challenges to national security arose, would the FBI, now so deeply scrutinized, ever be able to regain the public trust it had lost? How far is too far when it comes to surveillance? Should the FBI have taken the actions they did against activists and civil rights leaders? Let us know your thoughts below. Was this a necessary evil in the name of national security, or a violation of the very principles the FBI was meant to defend? The year was 1993, and in the quiet fields of rural Texas, something was about to erupt. The air, thick with the scent of dust and diesel, trembled with the sound of approaching helicopters. Far below, in the secluded compound of the Branch Davidians, a group of religious extremists, led by a man named David Koresh, waited in tense silence. They had been under siege for days, holed up in their compound, fortified and surrounded by FBI agents in armored vehicles. The compound, an isolated fortress built to house more than 100 people, stood like a monument to defiance. Inside, Koresh, the self-proclaimed messiah of the Branch Davidian sect, was surrounded by his followers, men, women, and children. Convinced they were on the brink of apocalyptic battle, the FBI had been investigating Koresh and his group for months, suspecting illegal weapons possession and potential child abuse. What started as an investigation into firearms violations had escalated into a full-scale standoff, with the FBI's hostage rescue team, HRT, taking center stage. For days, negotiators had tried to reach Koresh, trying to end the confrontation peacefully. but each attempt at dialogue seemed to fall flat. Koresh, a man known for his manipulative charisma, refused to surrender, and his followers were loyal, perhaps even fanatically so. As the standoff stretched on, tensions grew, and the FBI began to prepare for a more aggressive strategy. The siege reached its boiling point on April 19, 1993. By this time, the situation had reached a delicate tipping point. Negotiations had stalled, and both sides were entrenched in their positions. Inside the compound, the atmosphere was charged with paranoia, belief, and fear, believing they were living in the final days. On the outside, FBI agents and military tanks had amassed in a tight perimeter, ready to carry out what would become one of the most controversial and deadly operations in American history. At 6 a.m. that fateful day, the FBI launched its final assault. Tanks rolled forward and armored vehicles pounded on the walls of the compound. The sky above was thick with smoke as tear gas canisters were fired into the building, filling the air with a suffocating fog. The sounds of gunfire cracked through the chaos, the echoes bouncing off the walls as if the world itself was shuddering. From the first moments of the assault, things went horribly wrong. What had begun as a tactical raid designed to gain control of the compound quickly descended into something much worse. There were reports of gunfire from the compound, and the FBI returned fire in kind. The standoff, which had already stretched for weeks, had now escalated into a full-blown firefight. But as the FBI stormed the compound, what were they really after? Justice or revenge? Inside the walls, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The violent clash was not just about weapons or resistance, it was about ideology. David Koresh and his followers were convinced the end of the world was near. For the FBI, it was about bringing a dangerous cult leader to justice, regardless of the cost. And then, the unthinkable happened. The compound, under siege from all sides, suddenly erupted in flames. As the fire consumed the Branch Davidian compound, the world watched in disbelief. The thick black smoke billowed into the sky as flames devoured the structure, turning it into a raging inferno. The sounds of crackling flames mixed with the distant sounds of gunfire as the last stand of Koresh's followers unfolded in front of a stunned nation. In the end, nearly 80 people, including David Koresh, lost their lives that day. Of those, 25 were children. The final moments of the siege were chaotic, tragic, and brutal. The FBI's actions, designed to bring an end to what they saw as a dangerous, armed cult, had led to a catastrophic loss of life. A raid intended to neutralize a threat had escalated into what many would later call a massacre. But the aftermath of the Waco Siege raised even more questions than answers. In the days and weeks that followed, the American public was left to grapple with the aftermath. The image of the burning compound, the smoldering ruins where children and innocent lives were lost, became a symbol of a government gone too far. The FBI, a once respected institution, was now under a microscope. Were they justified in their aggressive tactics? Or had they used excessive force? The FBI's response was defensive, arguing that their actions were necessary to neutralize a dangerous group. They maintained that they had no choice but to use force, citing the heavily armed resistance by the Davidians. But critics were quick to point out the tragic consequences of the assault. What had started as a plan to serve a search warrant and make arrests had escalated into a military-style operation, with the FBI, ATF, and other agencies all participating in the siege. A firestorm of criticism erupted. Did the FBI's overzealous approach to the raid cause the deaths of dozens of innocent people? Was there a better way to handle the situation? And what role had the FBI's use of military tactics, such as armored vehicles and heavy weaponry, played in the final deadly outcome? The fallout from the Waco Siege led to congressional hearings. These hearings were meant to address the FBI's actions and whether the agency had acted within the law. What emerged from these hearings was a heated debate over government accountability, the use of force, and the consequences of federal overreach. For many, Waco marked the beginning of a new era of skepticism towards federal law enforcement. The question of whether the FBI was justified in its actions remains a topic of intense debate. Some believe that Koresh and his followers posed a legitimate threat to national security and that the FBI had no choice but to act decisively. Others argue that the Bureau's actions were reckless, heavy-handed, and ultimately caused the unnecessary loss of innocent lives. Regardless of where one stands on the issue, the Waco Siege left an indelible mark on the FBI. It sparked protests, outrage, and distrust of federal agencies, especially in rural and conservative areas. Many saw the incident as an example of government overreach and a sign of the dangers of militarized law enforcement. The aftermath of the Waco Siege would continue to echo throughout the nation. It led to widespread calls for reform, stricter regulations on law enforcement, and an increased awareness of the dangers of unchecked power. But there was something deeper at play, something that no one had anticipated. As the dust settled and the fires burned out, the question lingered: was the FBI prepared to face the consequences of its actions? Or had the agency's reputation been forever tainted by its role in Waco? Do you think the FBI was justified in their actions at Waco, or do you believe they went too far? Was the raid necessary to protect the public, or could there have been a better way to resolve the situation? Share your thoughts below. What's your take on the Waco Siege, and how do you think it has shaped the FBI's role in American society? The year was 1986. In the concrete canyons of New York City, the streets whispered with secrets, and the shadows of organized crime loomed large. For decades, mafia families had ruled the underworld with an iron fist, their criminal enterprises stretching from racketeering and extortion to murder and bribery. The FBI had long been on their tail, but despite the agency's best efforts, the mafia seemed untouchable, operating in the shadows, with its leadership protected by a code of silence known as omerta. But this time, things were different. The Bureau had a new weapon in its arsenal: informants. The FBI knew that if they were going to take down these powerful crime families once and for all, they would need to infiltrate from the inside. The task was Herculean. Mafia families like the Gambinos, Genovese, and Lucchese had been entrenched in American society for generations, with members deeply loyal to their organizations and distrustful of outsiders, especially law enforcement. For the FBI, the mafia wasn't just another case. It was the ultimate test of their ability to get results. With the mafia growing bolder and more violent, the FBI launched what would become one of their most controversial and ultimately successful operations: Operation Donnie Brasco. The first step was infiltration. In 1976, the FBI managed to place an undercover agent deep within one of the most notorious mafia families in America, the Bonanno crime family. The agent, who would come to be known as Joe Pistone, was a seasoned undercover operative. He was assigned to gain the trust of the family, rise through its ranks, and gather critical intelligence that would eventually allow the FBI to bring down the entire syndicate. The name he was given for this operation was Donnie Brasco. For years, Pistone worked his way into the mafia underworld, a world of brutal violence and deception. He sat at the same tables as notorious mobsters, exchanging pleasantries with men who could kill without hesitation. He participated in illegal activities, quietly gathering evidence while living a dangerous double life. Pistone's success lay in his ability to blend in, to become just another wise guy in the world of the mafia. a world where trust was as rare as loyalty to the law. He earned the respect of criminals who had decades of experience, all the while feeding the FBI information that would prove to be invaluable. The FBI had long relied on wiretaps, surveillance, and informants to track mafia families. But now they had something more: real-time intelligence from the inside. With Pistone's detailed reports, the FBI began making arrests, breaking down the inner workings of the mafia, and gathering evidence that would shake the foundation of the criminal empire. But the deeper Pistone went, the more dangerous his situation became. He wasn't just a target for the mafia. He was a man who had to constantly look over his shoulder, never knowing when his cover would be blown. For over 6 years, Pistone lived this high-stakes life, walking a fine line between gathering critical evidence and staying alive. But as the FBI closed in on some of the mafia's biggest players, they would soon face a challenge that no one saw coming. By 1982, Operation Donnie Brasco had gathered enough evidence to lead to indictments against some of the mafia's most influential members. But as the FBI prepared for the final phase of their operation, they received a shocking piece of news that would throw everything into jeopardy. One of their own informants, a key source who had been feeding them critical intelligence for years, had betrayed them. The informant, known only as Tony, a member of the Gambino family, had been feeding false information to the mafia, diverting the FBI's attention away from crucial targets. The Bureau had trusted this informant implicitly, but now they realized they had been played. The betrayal sent shockwaves through the FBI. In a world where loyalty was everything, this was a devastating blow. The informant had put not only the entire operation in jeopardy, but the lives of the undercover agents involved as well. The entire investigation was now at risk of collapse. It was as if the mafia had anticipated the FBI's every move, and just as the Bureau was closing in on the most powerful criminal family in the country, they were dealt a crippling blow. As the FBI scrambled to piece together the operation and identify the traitor, tensions mounted. The stakes were higher than ever. If they couldn't recover from this betrayal, the mafia would continue to operate unchallenged, untouched by the law. The FBI had no choice but to act quickly, relying on their remaining informants and shifting tactics to ensure that the criminals who had been so carefully targeted wouldn't slip through their fingers. Despite the setback, the FBI pressed on. The pressure was mounting and the clock was ticking. The agency's determination and Pistone's bravery paid off when, in 1986, a string of coordinated arrests was made. Mafia bosses, underlings, and enforcers were arrested in a series of raids that struck at the heart of the criminal organizations. The evidence gathered during Operation Donnie Brasco was undeniable. It was a blow that the mafia would never recover from. Pistone, now in protective custody, had completed his mission. The cost had been high, but the payoff was monumental. The mafia was dealt a serious blow, with over 100 convictions resulting from the operation. Several mafia bosses, including the notorious Joseph Bonanno and Dominic Big Tramp DeBella, were brought to justice, and the FBI's success in infiltrating the organization was hailed as one of the Bureau's most significant achievements. But even as the dust settled, questions remained. Was it ethical for the FBI to use such morally questionable tactics? Living a lie, engaging in illegal activities, and relying on deceit to infiltrate the mafia? Was it worth the risk to innocent lives, especially when they were manipulating informants who were themselves criminals? And what price had been paid for the FBI's success? Despite the monumental success of Operation Donnie Brasco, the FBI's relationship with its informants would forever be tarnished. The Bureau had relied on deceit, manipulation, and betrayal to bring down the mafia. But as the final arrests were made, a deeper question loomed. Was the cost of justice too high? And more importantly, Would the FBI continue to use these morally questionable tactics in their ongoing war against crime? The FBI relied on informants to take down the mafia, but was this necessary? Or was it a betrayal of trust? Should the ends justify the means, or was the FBI's manipulation of informants a step too far? Let us know in the comments. Do you think the FBI's methods in Operation Donnie Brasco were justified, or did they cross a line? It's 2016. The political stage is set for a battle like no other. The United States is gearing up for one of the most contentious presidential elections in its history. On one side, the Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, a former Secretary of State and First Lady, is poised to break new ground as the first woman president. On the other, the unpredictable reality TV star turned political outsider Donald Trump is making waves as the Republican candidate. The stakes couldn't be higher. As the race for the White House heats up, the FBI, an institution known for its investigative powers and political neutrality, is about to find itself at the center of a firestorm that would test its credibility, its integrity, and its very purpose. In March of 2015, reports surfaced that Hillary Clinton, during her tenure as Secretary of State, had used a private email server to conduct government business, something that was not only a violation of protocols, but also raised serious national security concerns. Clinton, in her defense, argued that the private server was set up for convenience and that there was no intentional wrongdoing. However, the media quickly seized on the story, making it a central issue in the upcoming election. The FBI began its investigation into Clinton's use of a private email server, and for months, it seemed like business as usual. Clinton testified before Congress, and FBI agents conducted their inquiry with a focus on whether classified information had been mishandled. The investigation was expected to remain under the radar, until the unthinkable happened. It's late October, just days before the 2016 presidential election, when FBI Director James Comey makes an announcement that would send shockwaves through the political world and the world at large. On October 28, 2016, Comey releases a letter to Congress stating that the FBI was reopening its investigation into Clinton's private email server due to the discovery of new emails on a laptop belonging to former Congressman Anthony Weiner, the estranged husband of Clinton's aide, Huma Abedin. These emails were found during an investigation into Weiner's alleged sexting scandal, a case that had nothing to do with Clinton. Comey's letter to Congress is short, direct, and remarkably vague. He says the FBI is reviewing the newly discovered emails, but doesn't offer any specifics on their content or relevance. This announcement, less than 2 weeks before the election, thrusts the issue of Clinton's emails back into the national spotlight, creating a media frenzy that engulfs the final days of the campaign. The public response is immediate and intense. Supporters of Hillary Clinton argue that Comey's decision to release the letter was politically motivated, designed to sway the election in favor of Donald Trump, who had already begun using the email issue as a central talking point in his rallies. They accuse Comey of trying to undermine Clinton's candidacy, especially given the timing of his announcement, just days before millions of Americans were scheduled to vote. On the other hand, critics of Clinton seize on the reopening of the investigation as proof of her guilt, fueling the narrative that she is unfit for office. Media outlets from every corner of the political spectrum jump on the story, dissecting every word of Comey's letter, raising questions about the propriety of reopening an investigation so close to an election. Was it the duty of the FBI to make the public aware, or was Comey being reckless? Inside the FBI, there's a growing sense of division. Some agents, believing in the importance of transparency, defend Comey's decision. Others, however, question the timing and the decision to go public without all the facts. The Bureau had a long-standing tradition of avoiding public interference in political elections, and many felt that Comey had breached that trust. Then, just days before Election Day, Comey issues another letter to Congress, this time to announce that the newly discovered emails were not relevant to the investigation into Clinton's handling of classified information, and that the FBI was closing the case once again. But the damage had already been done. The media storm had already spread, and voters were left to wonder, why did Comey choose to reopen the investigation in the first place? Why did it take so long for the FBI to reach a conclusion? The timing of Comey's initial announcement and the subsequent closure raised questions that would continue to linger long after the election. Was the FBI acting in the best interests of the American public? Or had it fallen victim to political pressures? Was Comey trying to protect the integrity of the investigation? Or had he inadvertently tipped the scales of the election? In the wake of the election, the controversy surrounding Comey's actions didn't subside. Many Democrats, still reeling from Clinton's unexpected loss, pointed to Comey's decision as a pivotal factor in the outcome of the election. The reopening of the email investigation was seen by some as the October surprise, a game-changing event that may have cost Clinton the presidency. In fact, many polls suggested that Clinton's lead had narrowed significantly following Comey's letter, though the extent of its impact remains hotly debated. On the other hand, many Republicans argued that Comey's actions had been appropriate given the seriousness of the allegations against Clinton. They claimed that the FBI had acted in the interest of transparency and had no choice but to act when new information had come to light. But the question remained, why had the FBI gone public with the investigation at all, especially without conclusive evidence? And why had Comey waited until the last minute to announce the closure of the case? The fallout from Comey's decision would continue to reverberate through the political landscape for years. While Clinton herself remained focused on defending her campaign and future political endeavors, the FBI's role in the investigation was scrutinized by both political parties, congressional committees, and the public. Accusations of political bias and interference began to mount, with some claiming that the FBI's actions had been intentionally designed to weaken Clinton's candidacy, or conversely, that they had been part of a broader effort to protect her from legal repercussions. But what was really at stake here? Was Comey's decision to publicly announce the reopening of the investigation truly an act of public duty, or had it been a politically charged move that ultimately undermined the FBI's integrity? As the FBI continued its investigation, it found itself caught in a storm of partisan politics, where the lines between right and wrong seemed to blur, and every action the Bureau took was viewed through a political lens. The fallout from Comey's decision is still being felt today, with accusations of partisan bias and distrust in the FBI growing stronger. But could this scandal be just the tip of the iceberg? Was this just a political misstep? Or were there deeper, more troubling questions about the FBI's role in U.S. elections? The answer might be more complicated than we ever imagined. Do you believe the FBI's actions were politically motivated during the Clinton email investigation? Did Comey's decision to announce the reopening of the investigation change the course of the election? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. April 15th and 2013, the sun was shining over the city of Boston, and the streets were lined with spectators cheering on thousands of runners at the 117th annual Boston Marathon. It was a day of celebration, filled with pride, joy, and anticipation. Families gathered to watch loved ones cross the finish line, strangers offered high fives to runners passing by, and the city's collective energy soared as the marathon drew to a close. But then in an instant, everything changed. The air was filled with a deafening roar. The ground trembled beneath people's feet. Two powerful explosions erupted near the finish line, sending a shockwave of terror through the crowd. In the span of just seconds, the festive atmosphere turned to horror. 3 lives were lost that day, and more than 260 were injured, many of them grievously. The world watched in disbelief as images of the devastation spread across television screens and social media. The bombers had used pressure cookers packed with explosives, nails, and ball bearings, simple yet devastating devices that caused chaos and destruction in their wake. The FBI was immediately called in to investigate, tasked with finding the perpetrators behind the tragedy. What followed was a relentless manhunt that would lead to shocking revelations, unspeakable loss, and questions about the FBI's counterterrorism strategy. Could this tragedy have been prevented? The FBI's response to the bombing was swift and determined. Agents, working alongside local law enforcement and federal agencies, launched an exhaustive investigation into the attack. The first challenge was identifying the perpetrators. Security cameras from nearby businesses, as well as footage from race officials, were scrutinized for any clues. Investigators quickly zeroed in on two suspects, Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, two ethnic Chechens who had lived in the United States for several years. But as the investigation began, disturbing questions arose. Had the FBI missed warning signs? Were there opportunities to stop the attack before it happened? The Tsarnaev brothers had been living in the US for over a decade. Tamerlan, the older of the two, had come to the FBI's attention previously. In 2011, Russian authorities alerted the FBI to Tamerlan's possible extremist ties. They warned that he might have become radicalized while visiting Russia in the years prior, and possibly meeting with known militants in the volatile regions of Chechnya. The FBI investigated but found no concrete evidence that would have justified further action. Tamerlan's activities raised red flags. He had posted extremist content online, frequented radical websites, and showed signs of increasing anti-American sentiment. The FBI had interviewed him, and though they monitored him for a time, the investigation was eventually closed, as agents had no clear grounds for further surveillance. Then there was Dzhokhar, the younger brother, a seemingly ordinary college student who had flown under the radar. His name hadn't appeared on any intelligence watch list. On the surface, he had no connections to radical groups. Yet, when the bombing occurred, it quickly became clear that the two brothers had been radicalized together, and the deadly attack had been meticulously planned. Once the FBI identified the Tsarnaev brothers as suspects, the manhunt began. The FBI, joined by local police, the Boston Police Department, and SWAT teams worked around the clock. Images of the Tsarnaev brothers, Tamerlan with his dark, intense gaze, and Dzhokhar, a seemingly regular college student, became plastered across newspapers, TV screens, and social media. But the pursuit was not easy. The brothers had already fled the scene, and the investigation had to move quickly before they could escape. A massive lockdown was imposed on Boston. Streets were closed, doors were knocked on, and SWAT teams moved door to door, searching for any signs of the suspects. The FBI was dealing with an elusive enemy, two brothers who knew the city well and had taken steps to cover their tracks. At the same time, the clock was ticking. Authorities knew that the Tsarnaev brothers were armed and dangerous. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Tamerlan was killed in a shootout with police. But Dzhokhar, the younger brother, managed to evade capture for a while longer. As the manhunt for Dzhokhar stretched into a second day, tension reached a breaking point. Authorities knew that they were searching for someone who had already shown an immense capacity for violence. The public was on edge, knowing that the fugitive was still somewhere in the city and the potential for further destruction hung in the air. The pursuit ended dramatically in Watertown, Massachusetts. Police cornered Dzhokhar, who had been hiding in a boat in a suburban backyard. With his capture, the full scope of the bombing began to come into focus. Dzhokhar was arrested, and soon after he was charged with multiple crimes, including murder and use of a weapon of mass destruction. The capture of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev brought a sense of relief, but it also left a bitter taste. The Boston Marathon bombing had devastated a community and shaken the nation, but as the dust settled and the investigation continued, one question continued to loom large. could this tragedy have been prevented? The FBI had been warned about Tamerlan Tsarnaev's potential ties to extremist groups. Should they have done more? Was there a failure in intelligence sharing between federal agencies? Could better coordination have stopped the attack before it even happened? Some critics argued that the FBI had dropped the ball when they failed to take action after the warning from Russian authorities. Others believed that, despite the missed opportunities, the Bureau had done all they could within the confines of the law. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the FBI had been dealing with a rapidly changing threat, one that was more difficult to identify and intercept than the world of traditional terrorism they had grown accustomed to. The question of whether the FBI's response was enough remained a point of contention, even as the Bureau's methods and decisions were under the microscope. The aftermath was not only a manhunt, but also a debate over intelligence sharing, the effectiveness of FBI counterterrorism methods, and tragic lives lost. Could better intelligence sharing prevent such tragedies? Was the FBI's response enough, or was it simply too little too late? Why do you think of the FBI's response to the Boston Marathon bombing? Could they have prevented it, or was it simply an impossible situation? Drop your thoughts below and join the conversation. The FBI has always stood at the intersection of justice and power, a federal agency tasked with upholding the law and protecting the citizens of the United States. But its controversial history tells a different story, one filled with complex moral dilemmas, questionable actions, and, at times, an unsettling willingness to overstep its bounds. From the COINTELPRO Scandal, where the FBI used surveillance, wiretaps, and covert operations to undermine civil rights activists and political dissidents, to the Waco Siege, where its overzealous tactics during a tense standoff left 70 people dead, the Bureau's history is marred by decisions that have raised deep ethical concerns. In 1986, the FBI was thrust into a war with the Mafia, infiltrating organized crime families and using informants who sometimes betrayed them. The agency was willing to bend the rules to bring down powerful crime syndicates, but in doing so, it faced questions about how far was too far when it came to justice. In 2016, during the chaotic presidential election, the FBI's decision to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails further complicated its reputation. Was it a legitimate investigation, or a politically charged move that tipped the scales of the election? This case is still fresh in the minds of many Americans, leaving lingering questions about the FBI's integrity and impartiality. And then there was the Boston Marathon bombing, a tragedy that not only shocked the nation, but also exposed the limitations and missteps of the FBI's counterterrorism efforts. Could they have prevented the attack if they had acted sooner? Could more effective intelligence sharing have stopped it before the bombs exploded? The manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers revealed both the strength and the weaknesses in the FBI's ability to deal with modern terrorist threats. Each of these events, from the COINTELPRO scandal to the Boston Marathon bombing, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, justice, and secrecy. As an institution entrusted with maintaining order and safeguarding national security, the FBI has had to balance its duties with the temptation to overstep its mandate. And each time it does, the repercussions are felt far beyond the walls of the Bureau. The emotional weight of these events cannot be understated. The lives lost in Waco, the enduring scars of COINTELPRO on civil rights activists, the families affected by the Boston Marathon bombing, and the political fallout from the Clinton email scandal have left deep marks on American society. With each case, the question of accountability looms large. Should the FBI be held to a higher standard, and can it be trusted to make the right choices when the stakes are this high? But even as we reflect on these controversial cases, we must ask, what does the future hold? As technology evolves, as new threats emerge, and as political tensions rise, will the FBI continue to navigate the fine line between justice and overreach? Will there be new scandals, new revelations that will challenge the Bureau's credibility and the trust the public places in it? The reality is that history is far from over, and as we look to the future, one thing is certain. The FBI's role in shaping the nation's destiny is far from finished. So, as we wait for the next chapter of the FBI's story, we must remember that the questions we've asked today may not have answers yet. Only time will tell what new controversies or cases will arise that will force us to question the role of the FBI in our democracy. Which FBI case do you think was the most controversial? Do you think the FBI is still trustworthy? What do you think the future holds for the Bureau? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your opinions on whether we've learned from the mistakes of the past. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most shocking and thought-provoking stories. Thank you for joining us as we explored some of the FBI's most controversial moments in history. We hope this documentary has made you think about the fine line between law enforcement and abuse of power. The story of the FBI is far from over, and as new revelations emerge, we'll continue to ask the most important question of all: who watches the Watchmen? Thank you for watching, and we hope this deep dive into the FBI's most controversial moments has sparked your curiosity and challenged your views on law enforcement and justice. The questions we've raised today are just the beginning, but now we want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the FBI has gone too far in its methods? What do you think about the cases we covered? Or is there another chapter in the Bureau's history that you think we missed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and let us know which case or topic you'd like us to explore in future videos.